Tēnā koutou katoa, e te mana whenua nai Tauhere, tēnā koutou, ko Ockhills te Monga, ko Forth te Awa, no Paratania o Kutupuna, ke te noho o ki Ototahi, ko Rachael taku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Haere mai and welcome everyone to our UC Connect lecture series. Thank you obviously all for coming. So as I said, I'm Rachael, I work here at the uni. I am a chemical and process engineer, which I know already sounds weird when I'm talking about endometriosis. But what I'm going to be talking about is kind of defining what endometriosis is, looking at what our patients here in New Zealand go through their journey to diagnosis. What do our GPs feel about this as well? Because we have to balance both sides of the equation. And then we're kind of looking at how we can model this. How can we make endometriosis in a dish? How can we kind of model it in a dish? And therefore, what can we learn from that to then come up with potential treatments or diagnosis offers? And then I'm going to finish with changes we kind of want to see and we hope to be a part of in the future. So to start off, what brought me here? Aren't I cute? So apparently my granny told my mum when I was playing on this tractor, all the grandkids played on it, and the way I was playing on it, they were like, she's going to be an engineer, because apparently the way everyone else just wanted to like sit there, and I was like trying to work out everything that was happening. I came here to UC to do my undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, and I distinctly remember a lecture when I was in a bioprocess course, and they were talking about mad cow disease, and this idea that I lived in England in that time, and oh my goodness, my brain could be shrinking because it stays there for like 13 years, and I freaked out. But I remember going home and sort of looking up what mad cow disease was, how it can be transmitted, sort of the mechanism of disease, and that got me really interested in terms of how the human body works, how it can be manipulated, and what sort of interventions can we do when it gets wrong. So then I end up doing research into the sort of aspects. So I go a bit more biological than classic process engineering. But looking at how can we understand the body, how can we understand how we can manipulate the body, and how can we sort of engineer the body to do what we want it to do. So down that line, just to kind of give you a bit of an idea of the work I do, my theory essentially is that whatever problem we're trying to solve, nature's already got there first. So looking at what can we apply from nature, what can we learn from nature to solve these problems. So maybe not like the modern jets now, but the first aeroplanes we modeled based on bird flight. We have the opioid poppy where we get our natural painkillers, and there's a reason we still use them, is because we haven't managed to do as well as nature's already done. Although apparently the first semi-synthetic opioid we made was heroin. So, and then also like burdock bars is how we got this idea for using Velcro. So my theory was like, what can we learn from nature and how can we apply what nature can already do? Because especially in the body is very good at healing itself. It's got a very good incentive to be able to heal itself. So looking at understanding how that works and then trying to sort of hijack those mechanisms to then get it to do what we want. So endometriosis. So endometriosis is essentially when tissue that's it's endometrial-like tissue that's sort of inside the uterus decides it doesn't want to be there anymore, and it essentially starts exploring and going in places it's not meant to be. It affects 1 in 10 of women and those assigned female at birth here in New Zealand. Those numbers are pretty similar worldwide. I think Australia's recently 1 in 7, they've updated it. And a large issue with this is there's a very long time to diagnosis. So from the initial symptom onset, on average in New Zealand, we're looking at 8.7 years until you get that diagnosis, which is obviously quite a long time for people to be in pain and for people to not have answers about what is wrong with them. You get a wide range of symptoms like chronic pelvic pain, period pain, cramping, infertility, mid-cycle pain, like nausea. There's such a wide range of symptoms that can come with this, which can also make it quite challenging, because it then makes it quite hard to diagnose, because it can then some of these symptoms can overlap with saying like Crohn's disease. And what people don't always realise is endometriosis doesn't just stay around the uterine area. We always think of chronic pelvic pain in the pelvis. It's been found in the brain, it's been found in the heart, it's been found in the lungs, wherever you can think of, it's got there essentially. So it's a lot more widespread throughout the body than people always realise. And what happens, you go to your GP, they've decided you've got endometriosis, and the first thing they're going to do is they're going to put you on the contraceptive pill. And that works for some people. Some people don't want to take a hormone treatment. And if you're trying to start a family, that's not necessarily going to be appropriate for your situation. So we clearly need a lot more solutions than what we currently have. And also what makes it incredibly challenging is you don't get a formal diagnosis unless they've cut you open and they've physically found the lesions. For the majority of people, that is how they have that diagnosis. It can be seen on some ultrasounds. There's definitely some technology coming in trying to work out to diagnose it via MRI, but it's a very invasive diagnostic procedure. So people either have like a working diagnosis, which is from like their GP or their OBGYN, be like, we're pretty sure based on your symptoms and what we know, but it's never like definitive until you're cut open. And we've talked to patients who feel like they're kind of not proper endometriosis patients because they haven't been cut open and kind of not feeling like their pain is as valid, which is really upsetting, really. So why does it happen? Well, there's lots of running theories. The main one is this concept of retrograde menstruation. So that is when the period blood, instead of going down, it comes back up the fallopian tubes. The issue with this theory is that 90% of women and those assigned female at birth will experience retrograde menstruation, but that does not line up with the numbers that experience endometriosis. So something else might be going on there. Is there a genetic basis? There's definitely this idea that it does run in some families. And then we also have several subtypes of endometriosis. So we have superficial or peritoneal endometriosis, we have ovarian, and then we have deep infiltrating endometriosis. And what I find quite intriguing is, are these subtypes of the same disease? Are they just completely different diseases that we've just thought, oh, they all kind of happen in the same area, we've grouped them together? Maybe a couple of them are related, maybe one of them isn't. And the reality of the thing, we don't know. There's still so much, frustratingly, about endometriosis. Well, it's good for me as a researcher, but for people with endometriosis, it can be very challenging. So endometriosis has been defined as a disease since 1912. And so it's obviously quite frustrating to still have so many questions we have not even started answering. So what steps are taken? As I said, they will put you on the contraceptive pill, but first of all, people tend to go painkillers. These are obviously not a good long-term solution, whether it's things like ibuprofen and paracetamol, or whether you step up to the opioids. You can obviously see how that can be quite challenging. We have IUDs, which I said some of our patients thought this was the best thing that could ever happen to them. And some people, it was the most traumatic experience of their life. So it's like everything, it's not one size fits all. It works really well for some people, and for some people it really doesn't work. And that also comes back to the idea that if you're trying to start a family or have a family, this isn't going to be a viable option. Medicinal cannabis has come up a bit more because it's quite challenging to get hold of in New Zealand. It's very difficult to get any data on what sort of level that's being beneficial here. Diet and exercise is always a go-to that the doctors go to be like, try this. And for some people, they have found that change to the diet has been really beneficial. And for quite a lot of people, it hasn't. We've had patients got told, oh, just go lose weight. And they lost weight and their symptoms got worse. So again, there's normally a lot more complexity going on. Physio, so pelvic physio and acupuncture are again kind of starting to come through as other options that can be used in terms of treatment. Counselling, so especially chronic pain clinics, have shown some positive benefits in terms of being useful for treatment. And finally, Botox, of all things, is in the last couple of years coming through as an option, because the idea is if you get an injection to the area, it may stop the cramps and the spasming that is leading to the painful symptoms. But again, that's a very new idea. So again, there's very little evidence, but very little information at the moment saying about how beneficial it is, how long that sort of treatment can last. Before we step right into sort of what our patients have been saying, I think it's very important, given this is a disease that affects women and those assigned female at birth, to think about what has happened throughout history to women in pain. And essentially what you find is in medical textbooks and history, man has always been the default, and the woman is defined by how she is different to man. And for anything for which there isn't a female equivalent, so like a uterus, that tends to be termed as a deviation, when actually, they're both equal defaults, as it were. So we have things like women are more likely to have a chronic pain condition. 70% of people who suffer a chronic pain condition are women. 80% of participants in clinical trials are men, so that's fun. Women tend to dominate reports of Medically unexplained diagnosis, you kind of saw that throughout history with this whole concept of hysteria. Unfortunately, I can say that 2 of our patients in one of our focus groups got told that they were hysterical and had that written on their medical record, so go us. We also have this idea that you're more likely to have your pain described as psychogenic if you are a woman. There's also this issue that if you are attractive, you can't be in pain because you look too healthy. And if you look unwell, well, you're an unreliable narrator. So there's still a lot of these issues that have been like developed through history, throughout, like, especially nowadays, I think it's far more unconscious bias than explicit, but these are still affecting women who are going to the doctor and trying to get their symptoms listened to. Women are prescribed lower quantities and less effective pain relief, more antidepressants, and studies have shown that providers tend to have lower goals for pain relief for chronic pain patients, such as endometriosis patients. We also have the issue when we come into endometriosis that there's this real normalization of period pain. You're meant to be in pain once a month sort of idea, and because it's still quite a taboo subject for a lot of people, people aren't talking about it. So people assume that what everyone else is experiencing is the same as them, because we do assume that as default we are normal. But if we're not talking about it, people are normalizing, trivializing their own pain because they assume everyone else is in this amount of pain. It must just be me. It just must be my tolerance, and I just need to suck it up because clearly all my friends are, all my family are. So that becomes a real issue. Throughout the talk, I'll have various quotes. These are all collected from our focus groups. I'm not going to read them out loud because I feel awkward because they're not my words. But just remember that these are quotes about, from like this one patient or whoever it is perspective. It doesn't reflect all experiences, but I think a lot of times they have some really poignant points to make. So whenever there's a quote, I'm just going to leave that up there for people to read. So, research focus. Well, right, we want to actually make a difference in endometriosis. We want to do some research. Where do we start? And so what we decided to do was we decided to go talk to the patients, which can seem very obvious, but you'll be surprised how many people in the lab, you have this amazing idea because you get really enthusiastic about your work. You go, oh my goodness, we can do this and we can use that technology and it's going to be incredible. But it's so important to make sure you're making a patient-centered approach, because whatever you come up with, you have to have uptake by patients. It has to be something that the patients are going to want to, you know, whether it's a pill, whether it's an implant, whatever it is, it's got to be something they're happy to partake in. You also have to talk to clinicians, because say it is an implant, like the surgeon's going to be the one who implants it, and they'll obviously have their limitations of what they can do. So although it's so easy to think you've got this brilliant idea and just rush to the lab, we really wanted to make sure that we were going to think about, well, talk to patients, because they're the ones who have these experiences, and let them tell us where they thought the problems were, so where we could make the most difference. So we wanted to know what they were going through, what sort of things did they want, and what did they think the research focus should be. So in order to do this, we ran focus groups. We've now run 4 focus groups in total. So our first was 2 mixed cohorts, so we didn't collect any ethnicity data, we didn't collect any gender identity or sexuality data. We did a Māori cohort, we did a Pacifica cohort, and we did a Rainbow cohort. And how these focus groups worked was that they, you know, we essentially advertised online saying if you are over 18, you live in New Zealand, you've got a working or confirmed diagnosis, and you identify as Māori, Pacifica, or Rainbow, please sign up. What then happened was every participant was given a pseudonym. They then had 5 days over which they could, go to their room, go to the cafe, wherever they wanted, on their laptop, on their phone, wherever it was, and log in and see the questions. Once they answered a question, they could then see everyone else's responses. But we wanted them to answer that question first in isolation to make sure that they weren't being prompted by other people's experiences. However, once they had answered, it essentially turned into a Facebook board, and these patients could interact with each other, and we got some really interesting data coming out of that because of that sort of relationship and talking going on between the patients. So what does this path to diagnosis look like? I've said it takes 8.7 years, but what actually does that mean? So our first step is you have to experience pain. Straightforward enough. But then there's quite that big step to, as I said, that whole taboo subject is realizing your pain is abnormal. Realizing that what you're experiencing is different. Realizing that what you're experiencing actually needs medical attention. You then make an appointment with your GP to go and talk about your pain. On average in New Zealand, I think people visit about 5 GPs before they actually get any forward motion essentially done. And so a lot of the time, you're dismissed. And people go back and they doubt. They're like, okay, well, I've been told by this medical professional, who I trust, because we do trust our GPs, saying I'm fine. Maybe I am just overreacting. No, I'm sure I'm fine. It must just still be in my head. And so it takes that much longer the next time to reach out. Because if you reach out for help and you're turned away, it takes that much more to reach out again. And it's also this idea that you're suffering a chronic pain condition. Sometimes a lot of our patients, they don't have the energy to have that extra battle to get the help they need because they're dealing with enough as it is. So you get to your GP and your GP listens to you like, right, we're going to do something about this. And they put you on a hormone treatment. Normally the pill, various types of the pill, but first line treatment in New Zealand does tend to be the pill. You take it and it doesn't work. So they put you on another one. And essentially our guidelines here in New Zealand say that we essentially have to exhaust all hormone options before your GP is then allowed to refer you to the specialist. This can obviously be very challenging. As I said, some people don't want hormone treatments for whatever reason. If you're trying to have a family, it's not necessarily a good option, but this is essentially what our guidelines encourage GPs to do. So you finally get that specialist referral, and it's denied. And we've talked to GPs, and GPs are like, I'd love to refer, but it just they're like, is this going to get denied anyway? And GPs who don't want to put their patients through all these hormone treatments, but they know they have to, because it's going to get denied if they try to get them to the specialist. So then you come back to another treatment, and you go through the cycle again. Maybe you finally get to the third specialist. You then get to go on a nice long waiting list, unless you're lucky enough to have medical insurance, or if you can pay for it privately. So you get on your wait list. And then you finally have your transvaginal ultrasound. Again, some patients have found this to be a very painful, traumatic experience. So you finally get that. You finally got to that point, and they find nothing. Back to the GP it is, and the cycle starts again. Maybe they do find something, and you finally get that laparoscopic surgery. Finally. And in 40% of cases, the lesions recur. So I was going to have like the arrows saying like how many people get through each stage, but it got too complicated too quickly for me to find some accurate numbers. But you can see that if you're already in a lot of pain, this is a lot to go through to try and get that diagnosis. There is a real problem. This isn't just here in New Zealand, this is everywhere around the world, where people are presenting the only way we can diagnose is through surgery, and look at all the things you're having to go through to get there. So you can understand why patients are very frustrated, why they can be a bit angry when they're trying to deal with and try and get people to listen. And you can really see the impact of those dismissal if they're being dismissed by medical professionals, because now they have to summon up the energy to have this fight all over again. We had patients who really found it beneficial to take in like a support person. Something like, if my parents hadn't been there, it wouldn't have happened. To have someone else to help them fight those battles because they didn't have the energy to. Or maybe they'd been told too many times it wasn't them. Tragically, if people brought in a male partner, suddenly the male partner was listened to, and that was fine. So yeah, getting to that diagnosis is a very challenging experience. I just can't explain it more than that, really. So we get to our diagnosis, and I said we have to have that invasive surgery. And just because you've had surgery doesn't necessarily mean, even if it's there, people are going to see it. We had one patient who got cut open, it's nothing there. Years later, they had a second surgery. Not only did they find the endometriosis lesions there, they went back and viewed the first surgery, and they were there in that surgery video as well. And this isn't necessarily the fault of any sort of specialist or surgeon, because also a lot of this comes down to everything in our health system. It's underfunded, and we don't always have the specialists we need. So you often have medical professionals who are doing the best they can, but they don't have the support around them to do as much as they would like to. So when we look at this delay to diagnosis, it's that our mixed cohort is about 7.9 years. When we looked at our Māori cohort, that was significantly longer at 11.6, Pacifica 12.4, and Rainbow Community 10.2. And those delays to diagnosis were significantly longer. So in terms of whenever we analyze data, we want to be like, okay, what is the likelihood that this difference happened by chance? And we did all the statistics, we're 95% sure this did not happen by chance. And we also talked to our patients, being like, well, how did you feel when you got diagnosed? And every single time, the number one emotion was relief. It's not in my head. I was right. There was something wrong with me the whole time. I knew it. Such relief to have that validation that their experiences for the last, up to 12.4 years, I think we had something 30 years or something, was real. And then overwhelmed because you've been diagnosed with something that does not have a cure. And then anger at all the people who didn't believe them, no matter whether they were friends, family, medical professionals, whoever it was in society. It's rough. It's really rough. And so say just looking at those delays to diagnosis, and so those nice little stars are kind of science speak for. We're pretty sure this is a real effect. This didn't just happen by chance. That's actually an issue. So we get to looking at what do patients actually know. So they've started to experience this pain. Well, it turns out a lot of them have never heard of it. They've never heard of endometriosis. And if you haven't heard of it, you don't even know it's something you should ask your doctor about. You don't know if it's something you should talk to people. Maybe you should even Google it, who knows. But if you've never heard of it, you can't really do that. Though, again, a large amount either never heard of it or knew very little. We only had 1.8%, and this is combining all our data. So this is over 100 patients. Only 1.8% either felt that they were well informed or very knowledgeable about endometriosis. So this shows us that there's clearly a gap being made here that we need to fill to work out how can we make sure that people are talking about that. And that's part of why I'm here today, to help people talk about this so that more people know. So more people know it's potentially an option, or even if it's an option that you can rule out. Yeah, we all need to know more about this. And then we wanted to look at, well, when people found out about endometriosis, how did they find out? 30% were finding out from their GP or OBGYN, around 20% from online research, friends, family, school education, which is great, but that would be really awesome if that was higher. A couple of people found out but from a novel. Don't know what book they were reading, but sure. But yeah, because then what this allows us to do is this allows us to know if this is where people are finding out, how can we put the resources into those places to make sure that we can spread the word more readily? And when we're talking about this sort of data, how do we get the stuff we're learning and research out to people? Dismissal was really a huge theme we found when we were talking to patients. So not being believed, being gaslit, being like, oh no, you're fine. We had patients who didn't get told they had endo, and then it turns out someone had written it on their chart 3 years ago. That's helpful. So whether it was not that they they weren't being listened to and being made to feel like they were faking, whether it was just like, oh no, you've just got a mental health problem, like you actually just need to relax and you'll be fine. And also I feel like there's always this pressure on the doctors to have all the answers, which can obviously be very challenging for them as well. And sometimes with some doctors, that means that you kind of get put in the too hard basket, or they don't want to acknowledge they don't know, so they want to it can give patients the impression that their voice isn't valued. And when we looked at what happened was, so if anyone who mentioned being dismissed or feeling dismissed or gaslight or any of those sorts of words, we looked at how that affected their delay to diagnosis, and it essentially doubled it. As soon as they're experiencing dismissal, that seems to have a real significant impact on how much longer it takes them to get that beautiful, well, not beautiful because it's a chronic pain condition, but actually get that validation that they have endo and something is tangibly wrong with them. So it was something we didn't even go out to find that just kind of came out of the data, and we're like, oh, okay. So we also wanted to look at what impact culture has, so Māori and Pacifica, because we kind of expected those numbers would already be out there, and then we went looking for them and we realized they were not. And like it or not, there is racism in New Zealand, there's racism in our health sector, there's racism in a lot of places in life. Again, how much of it's explicit or unconscious bias, I can't say. But we do find, therefore, that these patients face that double double whammy of the fact that they're being prejudiced against by their race and for their gender. And studies in like the US, Black and Hispanic patients have been found that they're less likely to receive an endo diagnosis than their white counterparts. We obviously can't say whether or not that means that they are less likely to have the disease, or whether this means that they can't actually access the tools they need to get that diagnosis. That data doesn't say anything. But it's very much a thing that, especially in places like the States, people who are in the ethnic minority struggle to access healthcare in the same way, say, like a white person would. And so when we asked our patients, did you feel that treatment was readily accessible to you? When we talked to our Māori cohort, 62%, like over 60% either said disagree or they strongly disagree. So we've got a large proportion who do not feel that the medical treatment they needed for endometriosis was accessible to them. And then when we look at Pacifica, we're seeing the same theme. 60% disagreed with that statement. They did not feel it. And then obviously the next step up is neutral anyway. 10% strongly agreed in Pacifica, and 18.5% either strongly agreed or agreed in the Maori cohort. So that's a large proportion who are not feeling that they can access that medical care that they're entitled to. And again, just mentioning again the fact that they also experience a longer delay to diagnosis. So they are struggling to get their diagnosis, and they are struggling to access the care that they need for their condition. So then we wanted to look at what themes came out in our Māori and our Pacifica cohort. We saw a lot of weight discrimination, as sort of being told that you just need to lose weight and that's going to solve your problems. You just need to go on this diet, you just need to exercise more, and that's going to solve all the pain you're in. Like all our cohorts, there were strong themes of assuming the pain you're in was normal, whether or not that was from your friends, your family, from medical people, whoever it was. There was this strong feeling of the fact that what they were going through was normal, and therefore there were much higher rates of medical gaslighting. And as that quote sort of implied, well, blatantly said, let's be honest, being able to be vulnerable and talk about these sorts of problems in that sort of scenario can be very challenging. And especially in like Māori and Pacifica culture, these subjects can still be quite taboo. And I did learn whakama, the Māori te reo for shame, during the course of the Māori focus group because it came up so much, which was depressing. We had 11 out of 27 of our Māori cohort get accused of drug-seeking behaviour when they were trying to either going to the pharmacy or going to the doctor, which is incredibly depressing. A really interesting one that came up was if you were trying to... They essentially told us that if they were trying to conceive, suddenly their body was important. Suddenly there were treatments and options available to them. But if they were like, this is very frustrating, because it's like this potential child that doesn't even exist was more important than they were, than what their pain was, than what their experiences were. We also saw conversely that if they had succeeded in having a child, well, you can't be that bad. There's nothing wrong with you. You're fine. So it was very intriguing that our Māori and Pacifica cohort in particular really found that there was this link to their body and fertility, and that was where the value of their body was. So that was very, that came through very strongly in this one. And so we had one, I think it was Pacifica patient, and her sister also had endometriosis, and she'd had a child and her sister hadn't. And obviously their experiences and their symptoms were different, but her family got a lot more empathy and sympathy from the extended family because, well, she can't conceive, so there's definitely something really wrong with her. And you've got endo, but you've had a baby. You've got a baby. You're fine. Like, you can't be as bad as her. When obviously whether or not you can have a child, fertility and subfertility is just one aspect of what endometriosis is, and then one aspect of what those symptoms and how they can present. They also said that they were very keen to have this idea of a endo-specific medical practitioner. And I do wonder how much of that's to do with the value they place on relationships and relationship building, because they also mentioned that they didn't have time. You don't have time in a GP's office, that 15-minute slot, when you're trying to talk about all this pain you're going through and trying to convince the doctor you're in pain, to actually build that relationship so you're actually more comfortable talking to this person about what you're going through. And then also that would improve the fact that each time you turn up, you're going to talk to the same person. So again, you're going to build up that trust, you're going to build up that relationship that's going to allow you to be more open about what it is you need. So moving on to sexuality and gender identity. So we asked same questions. Did you feel that treatment was readily accessible? Again, over half of our cohort disagreed with that statement. And they really felt that there was that the medical sector wasn't set up for this gender inclusive language, for thinking about that, it's not just all about penetration sort of idea. And the fact that they could still have these symptoms, they could still be in pain, and just because they didn't want a child, just because they didn't have a male partner, did not mean that their pain wasn't still valid. They found that medical professionals could become quite awkward, that they got asked more questions than their straight counterparts about why they were wanting to go on the pill, about why they wanted certain treatments, and then also this feeling of gender dysmorphia in terms of like they not belong in the body. And if you're not identifying as a woman, it can be very challenging to constantly have that reminder from your body about essentially an organ that doesn't line up with how you identify. So I know this may look familiar. This is what happens when we mix all the data together, which is why we've still got the treatment was readily available. So even when we mix our data together with our mixed cohorts and with our Māori, our Pacifica and our Rainbow cohorts, we still see that over half of our patients are not finding that the treatment they need is readily accessible. They are either disagreeing or strongly disagreeing with that statement. We then have a further 21.8% who are neutral. So we have what, maybe just under a quarter of patients who are trying to get treatment for endometriosis are feeling that they can readily access that treatment. And then we also wanted to look at what treatments are people using, what treatments are they finding beneficial? And this is a lot of sort of sideways reading. But again, so we have like our pain relief, so ibuprofen and paracetamol, which see almost 100% of our patients are being prescribed. Yet only 40% of them are actually finding that useful. And again, that's not exactly a long-term treatment you want to be going for. You find that essentially any hormone treatment is not well liked by patients. They're not finding it beneficial in treating their symptoms. The only things that are really seeming to have that people are finding useful are the laparoscopic surgery and hysterectomies. And maybe a bit of pelvic floor physio, but we didn't have many patients who were using that, so it's a smaller size. I mean, to be fair, the hysterectomy is quite a small size as well, but obviously that's a life-changing decision. It's an easy decision for some to make because maybe they didn't want to have a family, but especially if you're being diagnosed as like a late teen, it's really hard to visualize what you want your future to look like, and therefore that puts a lot more onus on you in a stressful situation to try to work out what's going to be the right thing for your body now, what's going to be the right thing for your body in the future. And because there's still so much we don't know about endometriosis and how it progresses, it can be really hard to give those patients the information to make those informed decisions. So yeah, finding that right treatment can obviously have a really, really big impact on patients' quality of life. But how are we paying for all this? So you get your laparoscopic, maybe you get your hysterectomy, whatever you need. Where do people get the money for that? And what we really found when we started asking these is people don't have the money for it. That people were having to make the decision between buying food and getting treatment, or buying medical insurance to help pay for the treatments they needed. And essentially you could either, hopefully maybe you're still on your parents' insurance, maybe your job comes with medical insurance, or you're waiting a long time on the public waiting list. I think CEO of Endometriosis New Zealand, she said, I think it was a couple of years ago, that if Christchurch Women's Hospital did endosurgeries and nothing but endosurgeries, it would take 10 years to clear the waiting lists. Yeah! Long waiting lists. So that's obviously very challenging. If you can't pay to access that private treatment, you're in for a long wait. And you're already in pain, and it's taking you so long to get to the point of diagnosis, let alone then treatment. Because those delays to diagnosis, that's not 8.7 years when all your pain is now gone. There's 8.7 years for someone to say, you have endometriosis. So people are finding it really challenging to actually, and this obviously links into being able to access that treatment. If you can't pay for it, it's not accessible to you because you're on these long wait lists. And I said, like, pretty much every health centre I know, like New Zealand's healthcare is underfunded. There's still so much demand on it. And how people are managing to afford this, because again, if you can't afford the treatment, well, we definitely need better options then, because we need this treatment to be available to anyone who is suffering, because you are in pain, you need something. So when we looked at how various cohorts were paying for this, we definitely found that, so we have our specialist payment there. Our original mixed cohort was relying on medical insurance, whereas our Māori and Pacifica cohorts had a higher reliance on the public funded system. And then our rainbow cohort between publicly funded and medical insurance. When we looked at how people were paying for surgery, again, our mixed cohort had far more people paying through, or accessing it through medical insurance, and more Māori and Pacifica looking at either publicly funded or Pacifica publicly funded and medical insurance. Rainbow, again, high reliance on publicly funded and medical insurance. So as soon as you're having to have that high reliance on that publicly funded, so we've got those long wait lists, which is then influencing that long delay to diagnosis. And again, we see very similar patterns here with our non-surgical treatments, where our Pacifica are really relying on that public health system, and Māori either private or publicly funded, and then our rainbow cohort are private, public, medical insurance. So it's very challenging for a lot of people that they've got this diagnosis and the treatment's just there, but you can't get through that paywall because you don't have the money, you don't have the insurance. So you just have to go back and wait. And sometimes when you're waiting for that surgery, you kind of get disengaged from medical setup, as it were, because you're on the wait list. So you're fine, even if you're on the wait list for 2 years. And so there's still that disengagement of making sure that your symptoms are constantly still being managed as best they can until you can get that surgery. Now we come up to the question that the patients always hated us to ask. We asked them, would you rather us focus on improved methods of diagnosis, or do you want us to improve the treatments available? And I don't think my PhD student has ever recovered from the fact that it came down essentially 50-50. This is what I was going to tell her. What should I focus on for my research? And, yeah, sorry about that, Katie. So I do think this is interesting though in itself, because if one was working, I think you'd see a further choice towards one or the other. But it very much seems like both are equally bad as each other at this point. It's not like they're both actually working quite well, and that's why people are like, it doesn't really matter. It's like, I can't make the decision. On the next page, like, I hated that last question because we made them choose one or the other. And yeah, it very much came down to both are in dire need of improvement. And then we asked them to rank their top 3 things that they'd like to focus on. And in all four cohorts, this is what it looked like. We always had subsidised care, research funding and education were always the top 3 options chosen. Not necessarily in that order, but they always formed the top 3. So this is what our patients want from us. They want us to have that better access to care, because it's expensive, it's behind a paywall, and that's causing a real issue for them. They want research funding, please, anyone. So we can start exploring new options, new opportunities, because also what we found out from patients is they don't want an invasive solution and they do not want a hormonal solution. And you'll be amazed about the amount of research that's going into invasive and hormonal solutions. So again, it's just making sure you're talking to your patients, talking to your end user, being like, what is it that you want? To make sure it's something that they're going to want to pick up at the end. And then education, and it was explicitly called out. This wasn't just education for patients, they also wanted better education opportunities for their medical professionals, so it was the GP or the nurse or the surgeon or the specialist or the physio or whoever it was. They wanted that education on both sides of the equation. Now what's interesting if you split that up into the different cohorts, for our Māori cohort, we had a choice towards improved methods of diagnosis, which came up again in our improved methods of treatment. That's not what I meant to say, was it? In our Pacifica one, they also wanted improved methods of diagnosis. And so this might be, again, due to the fact that they have a significantly longer delay. So they're waiting in pain and uncertainty for that much, significantly longer, and therefore they want more work gone into there because that was such a traumatic journey for them. But then when you look at our rainbow cohort, we see a selection towards the other side. They want better treatments. And again, it's pure speculation whether or not for our rainbow community, whether this is because so much of the focus is put on hormones, which is something that doesn't necessarily work. Because if you do not identify as a female and you're being given like estrogen, which is like, our female sex hormone, it's maybe not something you want to be taking. So you're just so again, that's pure speculation on my behalf, but maybe that could explain why they weren't finding the treatments, which are so often hormone-based, to work for them and their identities and their bodies. I mentioned at the top that we have to make sure we're looking at both sides of the equation. So obviously we have a lot of patients who are going through a lot, but we also want to make sure that our medical team are armed with the right resources, and we want to make sure how do we make sure, because we saw from that journey to diagnosis, they're your gatekeeper to further care. You have to get past your GP to access that specialist, to access that surgery. And again, they feel like they have the pressure to have all the answers. A study in France showed that only 25% of GPs felt they knew enough about endometriosis for their day-to-day clinics. So we wanted to know what they believe about endometriosis patients. Do they feel like they have the tools? What tools can we give them that is going to be beneficial? And this one is still in progress. I think last I checked we had 135 responses, but also this was partially inspired by a study we saw in Australia, and that is a direct quote from a clinician. Do mad people get endo, or does endo make you mad? And it was really interesting, the sorts of things some clinicians were saying, which were quoted directly in the paper. Apparently it's very frustrating when patients put their own lived experience against your academic experience as a clinician. That's really annoying, apparently. And the fact that if they can't come up with an answer, well, that's actually the patient's problem. Again, I'm just shocked some of the things that they were comfortable and confident to say out loud. So we've kind of focused in on, just to give you like a screenshot of what's going on. We're like, well, have you actually read the endo clinical guidelines? And nearly 2/3 have said no, they have not read them. To give them credit, they did come out during COVID. But then also when we asked in terms of the people who said yes, what did you think? Quite a few were like, I skimmed it. I'll use it if I need it. It's like, well, if you haven't read it. So yeah, we're trying to work out what they think of those guidelines and how can we make sure those guidelines and what training and how do we put pressure on in the right places to make sure our GPs have the tools they need, because we want to help both sides of the equation there. It's so easy to be like, well, the medical profession isn't helping us. We're like, well, how can we help them help our patients? We want to make sure we're really trying to have an even approach. Do you remember at the beginning when I said I was an engineer? Right back, yeah. So as I said, that focus group work got kind of out of hand, I'm not going to lie. But as I said, it was helping us to find out where our research focus should be. So in the last 5 minutes, because I'm already over time, just thinking of what we were going to do. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at, endometriosis gets everywhere in the body. So we wanted to look at how does it get everywhere? How is it getting about? Because it's one of the very few things that does invade other tissues. We don't want to say it's like a cancer because that's quite scary. I prefer to think of it's more like the placenta. When the placenta forms, that's actually a very invasive process that the body kind of puts up with because it's a short term, sure it doesn't feel like that at the time, process. But we wanted to know, how does it invade? How invasive is it? And what can we learn about those invasive mechanisms? Because if we can learn how it's invading throughout the body, maybe we can interrupt those signals and stop it from at least invading further. Can we at least keep it in a smaller contained area? So what we did was we did assays, which is fancy bio speak for we did an experiment in the lab. And because I said, we know that normal cells should not get around. We don't find heart cells in our feet. We know that things tend to stay in the right areas of our body. It just so happens with endometriosis it has other ideas. And we can use sort of these gold standard techniques that are used for cancer to work out, well, how invasive are they? How far can they get? And so what we did, we did use cancer cells because cancers tend to be very well characterized and we know what to expect from them. And we took endometriosis cells from patients and went, right, who can get through this the fastest? So essentially, again, that's just like a pretty picture, being like, oh, look, they're getting through areas they're not meant to. Those cells should not be able to get through the area. And what we essentially did, one of the experiments we did, was we essentially put the cells in, let's just say it's like a jelly. We put it in a gel where if you're an invasive cell, you can get out. If you're a non-invasive cell, we have locked you in the middle of the maze and you're not getting anywhere. And so we can look at how fast they can get out of that jelly and how fast they can get away from it. Because if you're invasive, you can do that easily. If you're non-invasive, you're just going, help, someone? I guess I'll just stay here then. Someone will come rescue me. So the idea. So when we looked at that white circle is, give me a sec. Ooh. Didn't quite mean to turn all of them off like that, but okay. I'm off later, bye. So we find that white boundary shows us where the cells should have started and where they should be staying if they're non-invasive. So we see a little bit of spread when there are non-invasive cells. So some of them are still kind of working it out. Maybe they're on the outside of the jelly, who knows. Cancer, you can see it's really gone, I don't actually need this space, I'm off. And endometriosis really goes for it. So again, this is kind of us trying to show this proof of principle that this is a very invasive process. And so we're now working on how can we get those cells to, how can we identify how those cells are getting through things. I'll turn the lights back on now. It feels a bit weird here on my own. So as I said, questions we still want to answer. We want to know how much hormones do influence treatments. So many treatments are hormone-based. So what impact is that having? Maybe it has no impact at all on how the cells invade, but if it does, we really want to know what the impact is. Because there are things called, I said, xenoestrogens, which are like, they behave and look like estrogen to the body, but they're not actually estrogen. And they're found in the environment. So is that having any impact? We also want to look at how the mechanical environment. So our skin's pretty easy to mold, but within our body, different tissues are of different stiffnesses. So some of them are going to be really soft, some of them are going to be quite hard. And what we know from hormone-driven cancers, and endo's a hormone disease, is that they make that tissue stiffer. So they make it harder, so then they essentially punch through it. Does endo do that? Because the evidence is saying that there is stiffening of the tissue around. So we want to look at whether or not endometriosis is doing that. Because if it is, there are cancer treatments we can hijack that are directed treatments to stop that from happening, which could then stop the spread. So we've done GP, we're in the middle of a GP study. We also want to look at nurses. Some places are kind of implementing a specialised nurse for endometriosis, so we want to know what the nurses are experiencing and what they think, and again, how can we support them? And again, I really want to know how these different stages differ from each other. How are we characterising them? I said, are they the same disease? Are they completely different diseases? And really starting to nail down what that does mean. So the changes we want to see, I'd really love these guidelines to be updated, so it's something that's really useful for our GPs and our nurses, but again, that's something we're in the process of talking to them about to see what they want and what they need. More education. We really saw that we needed better cultural training in our system because this is not an inclusive environment. People talking about it, that would be great. And again, as not taboo, actually getting people to talk about it is not embarrassing. This happens to half our population. And so I said, really trying to change the viewpoint on how everything's going. I'm 5 minutes over. I'd like to thank a lot of people. Obviously Katie, who's done a lot of this work. Visions Live, who gave us the software to run these focus groups. Vic, who have funded a lot of this. Researchers at Otago and Callahan, and also Michigan State University, who have donated cells. But also I just really like to thank our focus group participants, because some of the stories, they were very vulnerable with us and they were very trusting, and I was always very humbled that they trusted us enough to tell us these stories that had happened to them, because they're very intense stories for some people, and the fact that they told them to us was, I'm still just very honoured by them. So I'd really like to send a thank out to over 100 patients now for giving us the time and giving us their stories. I have to finish on this slide, apparently, to remind you that there are more talks, and you should sign up if you want to come on. But thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for going like a minute or two over, but obviously if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them if you'd like. Yeah, I'm just going to wait for the microphone so everyone can hear.
Yeah, I saw in the paper or something where there was somewhere here at the university that had a new treatment they thought for endo.
Somewhere here that had new treatment for endo.
Yes, it was just in the last few days. Was it sort of called EndoSoothe?
Yes, so EndoSoothe is a product that's been developed by one of the students in the School of Product Design. It is something that has been made as a treatment, but it hasn't gone through any clinical trials. So I really wouldn't want to say how effective that is because I don't have that data.
Kia ora, thank you. How can we follow your research to find out about breakthroughs or more information that you're getting?
I mean, I can always say follow me on Twitter. Or it's X now, isn't it? I mean, we make sure that everything we publish in academic journals are published open access because we want everyone to be able to read them. We want everyone to be able to access them. So whether you search through my profile on the Canterbury website, because that tends to be up to date with those sorts of publications, but we've really made an effort to make sure those things are open to everyone. And yeah, so always, whenever people ask me to talk, I'm always like, I want to come talk because I want us to continue this conversation. Kia ora.
Is this on? Oh.
Yes.
Did any of the participants also have PCOS, or was it just endometriosis?
That's a very good question. Yes, so I'm just looking at my student, being like, what's the answer to this question?
We didn't screen them for both, but some did say that they had.
Okay, yeah, so we didn't screen them for PCOS, but some of them did volunteer that they also did have PCOS. But yeah, that was never, there's another question at the back.
Was it the same with adenomyosis as well?
So for meiosis, again, it was the same. So some people did volunteer that information, but it wasn't information that we explicitly asked for. So we can just say that there were some overlaps, but I can't say whether or not, like the numbers on those, because it wasn't data we collected. It was just information they volunteered throughout the process.
You're saying that 40% get a recurrence.
Yes.
And for those that are going through the public health system, how long would they then have to wait? Are they sort of being told, well, you've had your one shot, you have to go down the bottom of the waiting list? Or
it's more just the fact is it depends how soon you can get around that loop to get back to your specialist, who can then say we're going to do surgery. So again, you'll go back to your GP and you essentially have to start the process all over again. So it depends how fast you get through that system, or how slow for that matter. So you're not put to the bottom of the list. There's no sort of priority on that aspect, but you do have to start your fight from the bottom.
Hi, having identified with a lot of what you've said tonight, I'm 8 surgeries in both public and private. Are the GPs receptive to actually the research and you wanting to help?
So with our GPs, we've kept their surveys very quick and easy because they're obviously very busy. So it's essentially just a not tick box, but it's just a lot of multi-choice. So I can't say on that. We've conducted 5 interviews with GPs who have been very receptive, very lovely. We're going to get an over-representation of lovely people and this. And so I think it's difficult to say because the people who are willing to give up their time to talk to us and to do those surveys aren't necessarily going to be the ones that patients are necessarily having problems with. We are definitely trying to, once we do all this GP work, we want to run events with GPs and patients, but we are aware that those kind of need to be run separately, so that would be really great to build the trust back up, because I know that's been really broken with a lot of people. I'm not sure I have the skills to do that. But it's definitely something we are actively working on and engaging with GPs, but because we're still in the early days, we've only been running that survey for a couple of months, and it said they have to opt in to do it. It's difficult to say, to be honest. Any other questions? Oh yeah.
Sorry, just when you say specialists, are they just all gynecologists?
So the specialists can be, gynecologists or essentially anyone who's had the training to do those sorts of surgeries. Would you say?
Yeah, they can also specialist groups like endocrinologists and that sort of
Yes, endocrinologists, and then also in terms of even like with surgeries, they often have to call in other surgeon specialists, because we had one up in Nelson where they're like, we need a cardiothoracic surgeon because we found it in the heart. So, but yes, when we look at going to that specialist, it tends to be, like the OBGYN or endocrinologist or anyone else who's got that skill set. Behind you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Clearly you've talked to a lot of patients and got a lot of their experiences, but we didn't get to hear too much about like where you're going with the research. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that. Obviously, I have endo myself, and I'm quite hopeful that there'll be more treatment options in future, so just curious to see where you're taking things.
Yeah, that's fair, because as I said, the focus group stuff gets there's a lot to say, and you never want to miss out any one group. So in terms of where the research is going, as I said, what we're really looking at is how can we work out how those cells are invading, and we're really hoping what we can do is use parallel lessons that has been learned in cancer, because we know how various cancers can invade. So we're trying to look at, can we identify how they're invading? Because essentially when they're changing that environment, they're sending out signals to the tissue, say, become stiffer, become stiffer. So we're looking at can we confirm that that's what's happening? Because again, no one's looked. I'm optimistic that we will find that tissue's being made stiffer. And then whether or not we can identify the right target to at least disrupt that. So we may not be able to stop it from happening altogether in terms of the sort of research we're looking at the moment, but more preventing that spread. So at least then if it's removed, it's not coming back and it's going to stay in that area, is essentially where we're looking. We're looking at using patient tissue, which is kindly donated from the hospital, and trying to identify what that environment physically looks like. Can we make a sort of 3D environment and kind of essentially create endometriosis in a dish, so that then we can actually properly test it and try to understand. So the key thing is trying to interrupt that signaling that allows it to go off, because there are various treatments there's an esophageal cancer that we know changes its environment, and there is a treatment that's not chemotherapy that allows us to disrupt that and stop that invasion. So we're kind of hoping that we can learn and go down that sort of path, because also if we can use a treatment that's already available, like for cancer, it also means it's that much quicker to get it to patients. So that's where our group in particular are going. There's obviously lots of groups who are going in different directions. Did that help? Yes.
Just a few things. How are you going to feed that back through to the professional colleges, say for the general practitioners? Because that's more common than high blood pressure or diabetes, and I suspect the length of time and training that they get for those conditions is...
We have definitely heard that. We've definitely heard they get maybe half a day in medical school on something like endometriosis. So in terms of feeding it back to those communities, we are working with, say, like Pegasus and other sort of GP networks, and I said that's why we're really wanting to make that headway on getting that those guidelines updated for something that's actually useful, because that's obviously the formal document that can be made accessible to that sort of community, so they can actually use it.
But it's also, I think, like you're talking about normalising some of the symptoms. So generally, if you have symptoms that stop you doing things, that's not normal. That's not a difficult concept, and if you're being prescribed codeine or tramadol by your GP, that's not normal.
So that's what we found was very interesting, what we found so far with our GP study, because we've asked what is your frontline treatment for endometriosis, and an alarming amount have said opioids, which is obviously concerning as a frontline treatment for something that's clearly not meant to be used, especially for chronic pain conditions. We've also had an annoying amount say get pregnant, and the evidence is not there to say that's even remotely helpful. So we're really trying to work out at the moment what it is that GPs believe, to work out, is it just the odd one who hasn't got that? So we've also been asking what sort of extra training they've had and how recent has that training been, to try to really get a gauge on what that picture looks like, to then work out what sort of, I don't want to use that word intervention, but what sort of engagement and to what degree is required. So we're working with GP networks here in Christchurch, and then we've got collaborators up in Auckland who are doing the same up there. Yeah. Yeah, I was like, they're both down here. I was like, race. Fair enough.
Hi, I guess just two comments. I have a running diagnosis of endometriosis because I was told by my GP won't be referred to a specialist because OBGYNs at Christchurch Hospital are only seeing women who have cancer diagnoses.
Interesting.
Yes, very interesting. I was also told over the phone on my lunch break that I had adenomyosis, which I was told was pretty chill. Since have discovered not the case.
I didn't want to be the one to tell you that.
Yeah. So I guess it's just, I would really love to see that when we engage with GPs, we don't just, when we talk about clinical guidelines, it's not just about this is what endo looks like, this is what the symptoms look like. We're having conversations about how important it is that when we're discussing this kind of thing, we recognise the toll that this is taking on a person's life as well. For many women or people who, were assigned female at birth, it is a conversation about, well, did you want kids? Or are you going to have kids? Or all those kinds of things that you don't think about at 16.
Yeah, and I think it's also alarming the amount of people who have said, I don't want kids, and well, I think it's you're denying your female destiny or something, got told to someone, and it's like, really? Yeah. But I think you also make a good point with adenomyosis as well, because I almost feel a bit guilty that endo's being talked about a lot now. Adenomyosis isn't.
1 in 5 women will be diagnosed with adenomyosis.
1 in 5 is that high.
Yeah.
So I really hope that by talking about endometriosis, we can start having those conversations as well, because by talking to endo patients, I know there's even more who have other conditions that aren't talked about. So I really hope that adenomyosis can come along for the endo ride in that regard. But yeah, you're right in terms of we're not wanting to go and tell GPs, you're doing this right, you're doing this wrong, but make it a conversation and really working with whether or not we can get patient advocates and get the sort of patient advocacy group to really come, so we can come together and have a talk about what's going on in this patient's life. And just because they're struggling with something today or they weren't struggling today doesn't mean that tomorrow they're not going to have a flare-up and it's going to be incredibly bad. And even we've had people whose bosses are like, oh, you're still suffering with that, I thought you were fine now. It's like, no, it's like a lifelong disease. So again, just really trying to talk and make sure that education, as I said, isn't just at patients, isn't just at GPs, but is sort of aimed at everyone, to make sure we're all talking so that we all have a better understanding of what different people are going through. And it's kind of alarming that it was also just, we have to say that sort of thing, because I always kind of thought it was, don't assume you know what someone else is going through, but apparently it needs to be said out loud.
I guess the only other thing I would add as well is that when we discuss why people don't want to go on hormonal birth or birth control or hormonal treatment options, I think the other thing is that it's not just about if you're trying to have a child, it's about the fact that for lots of people, being on birth control has significant side effects.
Correct.
Along with itself. It's not
there's a lot of side effects, and also some people just don't want to go on a hormone treatment, and that is their right as a patient to choose what sort of treatment they're on. So it's more than that. Maybe one last question, just looking at the time.
Yeah, so I have stage 4 deep infiltrating.
You have my sympathy.
And one of my best friends has the same. Do you think GPs might struggle with the concept of endo because of the fact that the symptoms are so different between two people who are even diagnosed with the same class? Same stage, I have I've got a lot of pain, but in comparison to my friend, you know, she's completely bedridden on certain days, had to be collected by an ambulance from work sometimes.
Yeah, it
the
can
pain
be
is so bad, but for me, I'm happy to go to work and can manage it relatively okay with quite a bit of pain med. But do you think they struggle with that even though you are presenting with the same stuff, you're so different in your symptoms?
I think that's part of what makes it challenging, is because people have a range of symptoms, and the fact that therefore there is crossover with, say, like Crohn's disease and other diseases. The fact that we don't have, it'd be great if we had like a blood test or a saliva test or something like that to give them that option, at least to just rule it out. But then I also think when you have very different experiences, it can then lead you to see your friend, like, well, my friend's in worse pain, so I must be okay. So then it kind of normalizes your experiences, even though you're both equally valid in your pain as well. So I think there's also danger that comes with that for the patients themselves, and not just at the diagnosis stage once you get to the doctor. But yeah, I think it's challenging because chronic pelvic pain can have many causes, and quite a lot of them are very challenging to pull out on a blood test or something very straightforward. So it can be challenging to know what should be considered, but I think considering endo should be more common than it is.
So do you think that they might not take it as seriously because of the fact that it's so differing between patients, or take the patient as seriously because they might see someone who's in 10 times worse pain compared to the next person?
I think maybe not that they might not take it seriously, but it might change their priority of who they push through to the specialist, because they know that the health system is jam-packed and only so many people are going to get through. So that might impact how they approach it. But yeah, I think it does make it challenging when we don't have those better methods of diagnosis to definitively diagnose, and we have such a range of symptoms that we can't necessarily point to something. And different GPs, one of the questions we've been asking is what weighting do they give to different symptoms. So there's definitely ones that they're like, oh, if they've got chronic pelvic pain, I'm going to look at that. But other symptoms, they may not really line up with endometriosis as much. Whereas if you look at the European guidelines, it's like if you have any one of those symptoms, you need to be considering endo in your diagnostic differential. In the New Zealand guidelines, if you present with chronic pelvic pain, you don't have to consider endo. So I think, yeah, we have a lot to do with that engagement to make sure that those sorts of information, you said, understanding why they struggle with, say, diagnosing endo, to work out what those gaps are to give them that support. I think I'm going to end there. Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate your attention and all the questions. For those who do have endo or loved ones who have endo, thank you so much for joining in the conversation, and I hope this kind of empowers you to go talk about not just endo but other things that we kind of think of as taboo, to really make sure we're talking about what's happening to our friends, our family, our colleagues, within obviously a respectful level, to make sure that people can actually reach out and are listened to when they ask for help. So thank you very much and have a good night.